We're here in the faculty lounge of Fuller Theological Seminary in their School of World Mission. And my name is Monroe Brewer, and I am coordinating a group of about 30 gentlemen here in the room that make up the California Association of Missions Pastors. And this is a group of men that meet regularly to discuss our church missions programs and to deal with issues and to help one another in this whole field of world evangelization. And our privileged guest today, we're his guest really, is Dr. Donald McGavran here at the school. And this is really just going to be an informal couple-hour question-answer session with the doctor. And Dr. McGavran, thank you for being here. We're so grateful for your life and the example you've been to all of us.
Well, I'm pleased and honored to be here, and this is an important meeting, and I trust that we'll center in on the heart of the problem facing each one of you in each one of your churches.
Well, I know that you really have quite a number of careers. You've been a missionary, and you've been an educator, and you've been a mission statesman and a strategist. Let's go back, though, to start off our questions in 1955, and it wasn't your first book, but a book that you wrote that really began to change forever your life in direction and ministry, The Bridges of God. Why do you think that book caused such a stir?
It caused such a stir because missionary work of all denominations, all branches of the universal church, in all countries, tended to become a lot of good work whether anybody became Christian or not. It tended to be good things done by Christians in the hope that people seeing those good works would be attracted to Christ. So that at least 90% of most mission work and at least 90% of most missionaries' work consists of helping other people through education, through medicine, through good deeds, through kindliness, through giving food to the hungry, and various other things. And maybe 10% or less goes into actually persuading people to become followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. That was the condition that I found myself completely immersed in. My first 7 years in India, between 1923 and 1930, were spent as the missionary principal of a missionary school system. We had a high school, and a middle school, and 3 primary schools. And enrolled in those schools were the best young men, boys of the town, the best families. The untouchables, they didn't come. The poor people, they couldn't afford the cost, the books and so on. But the best people, and we thought, as we reach these people and give them an hour of Scripture every day. I taught 4 Scripture classes every day. That these people will become Christians. Now, you can't make Christians of anybody under 18 years of age in India. It's against the law. But we said they will learn Christianity, they will come to love Christ, and then later on, maybe they'll be baptized, and if they're not baptized, their children, or if they're not baptized, their grandchildren will be baptized, because they're being introduced to Christ. That was the theory. Then when I went back in 1932, the fall of 32, I'd been studying for my doctorate in Union Seminary in New York and Columbia University. And when I went back in 1932, I was located in Jabalpur as the field secretary of the India mission of the Disciples of Christ. It was a big mission, 75 or 80 missionaries. And I found that my experience was the experience of most of our missionaries. And one day I happened to look up and see how much have we grown in the last 10 years, between 1921 and 1931. And I found that we had grown 11%. 1% a year. I was amazed. I was dismayed. And I said, what are we doing the other missions aren't doing? So then I did something, I suppose really God told me to do it. I said, let's find out what the other missions are doing. And I investigated carefully 145 other mission stations. Some were Baptist, some were Presbyterian, some were Methodist, some were Covenant, some were Evangelical, some were United Church of Canada, and so on. And you know what I found? I found that in 135 of those stations, they had gotten 9, 10, 11% growth during the years 1921 to 1931. And then I found that in 11 stations, the growth had been 50%, 100%, 200%, 300%. And I said to myself, what are those people doing that we're not doing? What is it that needs to be done in order to find the lost, in order to win to Christ, in order to multiply churches? And since I didn't know anything about that, I turned to a Methodist missionary, J. Wascom Pickett. I had read his book, Christian Mass Movements in India. And he had been investigating the places in India where there had been great movements to Christ. I read that with interest, amazement, thanksgiving. And then I said to the Provincial Christian Council, I was a member of that also, I said to them, we ought to do a similar survey here and find out why it is that 135 of our stations, the church is growing this way, and in a few it's growing this way. What can we do down here to get all of us growing that way? So they said, fine. And we made an arrangement with Wascom Pickett to come and spend 6 weeks in our area. And they said somebody ought to go with him, buy his railway tickets and see that he gets there and so on and so forth. So they said, you proposed it, you go. It was, maybe someone thought not a big enough task for them, but at any rate. So I went with him. And for 4 weeks, I had the great privilege of seeing how he investigated the work done in various areas. That was a very educative experience in my life. And its education was greatly enhanced by the fact that after 4 weeks we had 3 stations yet to do where the church was growing. Pickett said to me, look, I've got some other work to do, and you know how to do this now, you go ahead and you do this. So I started in it and did it. And as I investigated, I began to see what were the things that God uses to grow the church, and what were the things that are good work, they're Christian work, they're kindly work, they're gracious work. They teach the gospel, they tell people about Christ, but they don't win the lost. What is it that the shepherd does when he goes out to look for a lost sheep and comes back without finding him? And what are the things he does when he goes out and he finds the lost sheep and brings him home? That was the question. Well, I was field secretary for my mission, and I was laying these things on the hearts of my fellow missionaries. And I think they got a bit tired of it. At any rate, after 3 years, they said, look, McGavran, if you're all as interested in it, why don't you go out and do it yourself? So they didn't elect me as field secretary the next time, and they sent me out as village evangelist to a place 30 miles off the railway, where there was a possibly receptive group cast of people, the Satnamis, and they said, now let's see you do the things you're talking about. That was a very difficult decision for me. I'd just got my PhD in education. I'd spent 6 years in school work. I had written a book, How to Teach Religion in Mission Schools, that had been a fair success, been translated into 6 Indian languages. And for 3 months, I battled that. For 3 months, I said, Lord, this is not your will for me. I was telling him, he wasn't telling me. And I'm going to resign from this mission and go to some other mission. But finally, I said, all right, Lord, if you want me to do it, I'll do it. So we went to this place well off the railway. And I thought it was going to be 3 or 4 years. We started trying to win people in sufficient numbers so that there would be a people movement for Christ. It didn't happen. We went home on furlough in 1939, came out in 1940. Same job. Those were the war years. We came home again in 1947. And there had been 15 or so small churches started, but that's all. Any great movement hadn't occurred. But I was definitely trying day after day, week after week, month after month, in my prayer time, in my thought time, in my writing time, in my speaking time, how do we get movements to Christ? How can we win people? How can we multiply churches? When we went back for my 4th term of service in 48, we again went to the same place, the same area. But by that time, the people had grown cold. And during my 4th term, from 48 to 54, there were very few additions. Now, along about 1952, here's where I answer the question. How did you come to write? How did you come to write that? With all this background, some convictions had begun to burn in my heart. And I said, this is something that everybody ought to know. But missionaries are not supposed to write books. They're supposed to do work. So I took my vacation, and I went up into the jungle 20 miles north of where we lived, and rented a bungalow there, and stayed there for 6 weeks. And from 7 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the evening, I was writing How Peoples Become Christian. And that's where the Bridges of God was written. And then I said to myself, we're going on furlough, I said to myself, all the illustrations in here are from India. But I'm speaking to a condition that is common all around the world. If I print a book in which all the illustrations are from India, they'll say, oh, that doesn't apply to us, we're in Africa or we're South America or whatever. So I said to my wife, we're going on furlough, I said, you take the children and go down to Bombay, and get on a ship, and go up through the Red Sea and around to London. I'll go down to Bombay, get on a ship, sail directly west to Mombasa, and then I'll find my way across Africa. I don't know just how, but there must be a way. And we'll come out at Liberia and come in there. And I'll get a lot of experience in. Well, I didn't know how difficult that was going to be. But I did go there, and I was in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Urundi, Belgian Congo, now Zaire, Nigeria, Gold Coast. And then the time came to fly to London and meet my wife. The book that I had written in the meantime was sent to New York to Friendship Press. And Friendship Press looked at it and, yes, there's some good things here. So they Xeroxed, no, it wasn't Xerox in those days, it was mimeographed, 100 copies of it, and sent it out to the missionary secretaries of the great boards and to mission executives of the great boards. All the mission executives said, yeah, this is a good book, let's publish it. all the missionary education people said, if we send this out to the churches in America, encouraging them to do missionary work, they'll say the missionaries are making a lot of mistakes. Don't publish it. Finished. So Friendship Press said, we won't publish it. But they said, we know Sir Kenneth Grubb in London. He's the head of World Dominion Press. We'll send him a copy and see if he'll publish it. So Kenneth Grubb wrote back and said, have McGavran visit me on his way home. So I went to Sir Kenneth Grubb in London, and he said, well, let's go down to the Authors Club. So we went down to the Authors Club, a big gray building in the heart of London, and went upstairs, and he sat down in one leather-covered chair, and I sat down in another. He said, what do you have to drink? I said, I think I'll have a cup of coffee. Well, he said, I think I'll take a beer. So he had his beer, and I had my cup of coffee. Then he said, now, McGavran, I'll publish this book, but he sat down. He said, you're very wordy, and I'll have to, improve this. So I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, just watch. He took chapter 1. I looked at my book being slaughtered. And I stood there getting angrier and angrier. But fortunately, before he finished that chapter, it took him about a half an hour. Before he finished that chapter, I said to myself, if I say no, he won't publish it and there'll be no publication. So he said, well, I said, Sir Kenneth, that looks wonderful. Please publish it. So he said, I will. And that came out as The Bridges of God. He didn't like the title, How Peoples Become Christian, although that was much more accurate. I liked it, but he didn't. So we published under the title, The Bridges of God. And that did have a remarkable effect all across the world. Frank Price, a Southern Presbyterian missionary who had been in my class at Yale in 1922, he said he was then the head of the Missionary Research Library in New York City. He said it was the most read missionary book in 1956. Well, that started things. That was how it all began. That was how my mind changed from this to that.
Great. Can we go on from there? Let's ask another question. I'm assuming that Wascom Pickett had an influence on your life. Is there anybody else down through the years that has also helped shape your thinking that we should know about?
Wascom Pickett, who later, by the way, became a bishop, so people now refer to him as Bishop Pickett, he did have a considerable influence. However, Wascom's view was limited strictly to India. He didn't see, until after The Bridges of God was published, that what he had said there in regard to the people movements in India could be applied all around the world. And that was something that God revealed to me. Now, you were asking, were there other men? Yes, there was the secretary of my missionary society, United Christian Missionary Society, Virgil Sly. He liked what he read in The Bridges of God. And he said what McGavran has done in India and Africa, he ought to do in other places. So when the time came for me and my wife to go back to India, he said, no, we'll send you to Puerto Rico. Why have our churches grown like that and then leveled off? Go down and find out. So I said, I will, provided that you will also let me study the Presbyterian and Methodist and Baptist and other churches down there. I don't want to study just ours, because you won't really know how things are going unless you study several different denominations and see what other people are doing. Are they growing? Have they leveled off? What's happening? So they said, by all means. So I spent 2.5 very instructive months in Puerto Rico. And then they said, we want you to go to the Philippines and do the same thing. So next year I went to the Philippines and did the same thing. And And while I was in the Philippines, I came to know one of the bishops of the United Church of Christ there very well. And he said, you know what you've done for the Christian church mission field, you ought to do for all of the Philippines. He said, I'll try to get that passed. So the next year he did. And the United Church of Christ in the Philippines called me to do a survey of the Philippines from the top to the bottom, from the north to the south. That was a wonderful experience, a wonderful experience. I saw all kinds of missions in all kinds of places, urban and rural, the deep forest, the countryside, the fishing villages, the inner city, the slums, the educated. In all of these places, I had an opportunity to look. How has the church grown? Has it leveled off? Has it not leveled off? And so that was published, Church Growth in the Philippines. The executives of the United Church of Christ didn't like it at all. They didn't want it published. But I said to them, no, you promised to publish it, so they did. Unfortunately, they published it in a very poor form. It's full of printing errors, but still, it had quite a considerable effect there in the Philippines. And then there were other countries to which I was sent, and gradually I began to build a theory of mission. None of this would have been possible if Virgil Sly, the secretary of my board, hadn't funded this. It takes money to go there and stay there, pay the salary, and so on. So there's another man to whom I owe a great deal, and whom the church growth movement owes a great deal.
Anyone else stand out in your mind?
Oh, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people. As I visited the fields and then visited the churches in America and the pastors in America and the mission executives in America and talked to them, there were scores, maybe hundreds of them. And as they talked to me, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, I would begin to see how the missionary challenge, the need to evangelize, the command to evangelize, the opportunity to evangelize was being redeemed, let's say, was being obeyed and was not being obeyed, where the churches were growing and where they were not growing. It was during that period that I also saw that here in America, a great many churches are not growing. I remember the amazement, the absolute amazement that struck me one day as I suddenly realized that the most orthodox churches were frequently the least growing. The liberal churches, yes, naturally they wouldn't grow. But the Orthodox churches, why weren't they growing? And then I made another very interesting decision. The growth of the Orthodox churches had been very fast while they were separating from their liberal companions. After they had separated, their growth stopped. Roger Headland, a conservative Baptist, threw a lot of light on that when he studied here at the School of World Mission, 20 years ago now, I suppose, 18 at any rate. And he did a survey of the church growth of the conservative Baptists. Now they split off from their fellows back in 1940, 45, someplace along in there. And for a while they grew wonderfully. And then they leveled off. He said, why? They grew as long as their growth was getting the conservative parts of the old churches and bringing them into the conservative Baptists. After they had done that, they were not winning the lost, the secularists, the humanists, the careless Christians. And at that point, he was both astounded, distressed. And when he published his book, or he didn't publish it, when he sent a copy of his doctoral dissertation to the Conservative Baptists, they thumbs down. This is too negative. We want something much more positive than this. In short, my friends, a lot of our work is done on a promotional basis. It has to be. I've done a lot of promotional work as a missionary. Now, when we work on a promotional basis, we don't lie, but we do tell a good story. And somehow or other we've got to see the real situation. We've got to see the real situation. Every pastor, I think, particularly missionary pastors, they sit in two chairs. One is the promotional chair. And when they're sitting in the promotional chair, they speak encouragingly. Naturally. We've got to raise money. But then they sit in the diagnostic chair. And when they're sitting in the diagnostic chair,
they cut support off.
They are speaking to God about the real situation. And then is when they begin to say, how are we growing? Where are we growing? Where are we not growing? Where are the lost sheep? You know, the Lord told that parable about the good shepherd who had 100 sheep, and one of them got lost. So he left the 99 in the fold and went out after the one lost sheep. When he'd found it, he brought it back rejoicing. I've frequently wondered, what would the good shepherd have done if he had found 20 in the fold and 80 lost? Because, you know, that's the position that most of us face. That's the position that most of us face. A tidal wave of secularism has swept over the Christian West. I was in Finland 8 years ago, and I was talking to top Lutheran authority. I said, how many Finns are Christians? Oh, he said, 94.6% are Lutherans. I said, how many of them are in church on Sunday? Well, he said, less than 5%. And on communion Sundays? Less than 1%. Well, I was amazed. But his statement is supported by so many people in other parts of the Christian West. We had 23 German pastors visit us here a couple of years ago. And at lunch hour, I was sitting across the table from a Pastor Peter. And I said, Pastor Peter, tell me about your parish. Oh, he said, there are 4,000 people in my parish. I said, that's wonderful. Wait a minute, he said. Of the 4,000, only 100 are in church on Sunday. And I have contact with 300 more. But with 3,600, I have no contact at all. Peter Brierley is a church authority in England. I saw a printed statement of his that filled me with amazement, dismay, disbelief. So I wrote him a letter. The statement was that in England, Scotland, and Wales, the big island as we think of it, in England, there are 54.5 million people. Of these, 6 million are regular Christians, practicing Christians. They're in church on Sunday, they give, they pray, they know the Bible. Then he said 5 million are nominal Christians. They're there on Easter, Christmas, weddings, and so on. But they're nominal. Then he said there are 25.5 million. Did you hear? 25 million. 25.5 million are what he called notional Christians. I'd never heard that word before. So I wrote to ask him what is notional. Well, he said, if you ask them, are you a Christian? They'll say, yes, I'm an Englishman. Of course I'm a Christian. That kind of people. Notional Christians. And then the 18 million are openly agnostics, atheists, Marxists, secularists, humanists. They are outside of the church. And when I was in London the last time, a Christian sociologist was driving me through East London. Now he said, this is a part of London that nobody ever sees, that people from the West never see. They see West London. But this is east of the Tower of London. This is Factory London. This is Dockside London. And here, he said, 98% of the people never go to church. 98%. And I said, that must be because you got a lot of Muslims here and Hindus and animists. No, he said, I'm speaking about the 98% of the white British-born people. And as we drove through there, we saw church after church that was locked, broken windows, locked, broken windows, locked, broken windows. Now we say, well, fortunately, that is not the case in America. Here, we're a very different picture. And that is probably true to some extent. Although when we moved here to California 23 years ago in 1965, I was asking on this point, and somebody said to me, who ought to have known, he said, well, about 30% of the population here are more or less Christian, but 70% are not Christian at all. And then 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago now, I was doing a series of addresses in a California town of 30,000. And it had 62 churches. And I said, hey, this is pretty well churched. But when I got there and started to investigate as to the real situation, I found that of the 30,000 in church on Sunday, there were only 5,000. 25,000 were not in church. I didn't believe it. Not with all these churches. But that was the case. Now what I'm saying here at this juncture, in answer to this question, is that we really have got to see the real situation. We really have got to see the exact situation. We really have got to see the unchurched segments of our own population, to say nothing of Africa, Latin America, the Philippines, Indonesia, and on and on. And that is because of the fact that the Lord has commanded this. Effective evangelism is not just something that you do, when you feel like it. It's something that is commanded, so it must be done.
Let's address that a little bit more specifically. Your principles of church growth grew up on the mission field.
Yes.
And then as you founded the Fuller School of World Mission in 1965, the focus was still on the mission field.
Right.
But as we began to study these principles, many others like Win Arndt, Virgil Gerber began to say, well, these are things that maybe could be used here in the United States. So let's take the transition now and say, how did your thinking actually get transferred to the U.S. church? What good things resulted, and is it all your thinking, or has it gone some different directions now than perhaps what you said to begin with?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it because it concerns all of us. Do church growth principles apply here in the United States? Do they apply in California? Do they apply in Pasadena? And I'm inclined to say yes, they do. Yes, they do. Because the situation here is quite similar to the situation elsewhere. Now let me back up my remarks by a sociological fact that I think all of us ought to take carefully into account. And that is that the citizenship, mankind, men in general, are not a homogeneous unit. The American population is not like this white wall all the same. Mankind is a mosaic made up of many different pieces. If you'd go down to Mexico City and go visit the university, the first building you'd come to would be the library. And as you walk past the library, you'd look up at the wall, and there's a beautiful picture, outdoors. And you say to yourself, how in the world did the paint survive the rain and the sun and so on? Then you go closer, and you find that that picture is not made with paint. It's made with little glass cubes. Some black, some white, some pink, some yellow, some purple, some green, some gray. That makes the picture. And it'll be there for 100,000 years or more. Mankind is a mosaic like that. Now that is so contrary to the American idea. We're all one people. We all get the same pay for the same work. Our children all go to school and get the same education. We're all equal. And we're going to have people of all sorts come to our church. Well, that's a great idea. But does it work? Does it really win people? And the answer to that is it wins a few. But it doesn't get into the great segments of population that need being won. Let me give you a few illustrations. I was speaking in a covenant church, 15, 20 years ago, here in Los Angeles, and it was a Spanish church. There was a Spanish audience. So I spoke in English and was translated into Spanish. Afterwards, I was talking to the deacons and the elders, and the ladies, and I said, are there any Hispanics in the neighborhood? Oh, they said, from here on south, there's nothing but Hispanics. I said, this church could then multiply a lot of churches. Well, they said, not quite. You see, they're Mexicans. I said, what on earth are you? We're Colombians. We're Colombians. Colombian Hispanics feel their way up here, and Mexicans are down here. And then I realized, yes, because the Puerto Ricans, where I did my investigation back in 1955, 56, they also feel they're above the Mexicans. Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Colombians, and the Argentinian Hispanics think that they're at the top of the pile. Argentinian Hispanics have never joined a Mexican church. And neither did the Colombians want to. And then there are recent arrivals, and first generation, and second generation, and third generation, and fourth generation Hispanics. All of those are different communities. We had a meeting of Hispanic pastors here at the School of World Mission a few years ago. And in one of the question periods, I was asking them questions. I said, who are your most receptive pieces of the Hispanic mosaic? Oh, they said the recent arrivals. And I said, if you would really try to win the recent arrivals, could you do so? They said, man, they'd swamp us. Did you hear what they were saying? We don't want those dirty new arrivals. They bring in too many problems. They'd swamp us. That's what they asked. I dropped the question right there. In other words, there are segments of the Hispanic population. There are segments of the Chinese population. I spoke a couple of times down in the True Light Presbyterian Church, which is a Chinese church, down, 15 miles or so in this direction. And I said to them, look, there are thousands and thousands of Chinese immigrants coming in here. Could you people start churches? And well, they said, if they're of the right clan. I said, what do you mean? Well, they said, all the members of this church belong to 3 Chinese clans. If people of those clans come, then they are quite open to a visit from us. But if other clans come, they're not. I'd never heard of that before. I'd heard of castes in India, and I knew how clearly it worked there. But I'd never heard of clans in China. But that's what they told me. In short, my friends, we have got to seek to plant churches in every segment of the population. In every segment of the population, we must multiply churches. I have had quite a good deal of conversation on that point with my Indian friends. Now, there are quite a lot of Indians here in Southern California, and some of them, a few of them, are Christians. And I go to churches, 500 white people, and 3 or 4 Indian ladies with saris on. They look quite different. And I think, that's fine. They're just taking these Indians in with them. And then I started to think, when these Indian ladies go to somebody else and say, come to our church, they'll say, yes, if we go to your church, we'll stand out like a sore thumb. We wear saris, none of the other ladies do. We're not their kind of people. And when we go to a church supper, the food doesn't have the right amount of pepper in it either. And it's very tasteless. So I said to my Indian friends one day, as we were meeting, I said, look, what we really need to do is to start Indian churches where practically everybody wears a sari, every woman. And the men are all one sort. And when you invite your Indian friends there, they'll say, hey, these are our people. We like to go here. And when we have food, it's the right kind of food. Tastes wonderful. And we can talk about India. And people will all understand because they know India. In short, we must take quite seriously the biblical words panta, ta, ethne. Those are 3 Greek words that occur again and again and again and again in the New Testament. Panta, ta, ethne. All the segments of the population, they will come in segment by segment. Now, some one of you is sure to say, well, wait a minute. Won't this deal brotherhood a great blow? Aren't you advocating racism, segregation? No, never. I've been battling for brotherhood all my life. My grandfather and his brothers enlisted in the war to free the slaves. They never called it the Civil War. That was a wrong term. War to free the slaves. Mrs. McGavran and I joined a black church back in 1958. And the black church had to have 2 meetings of the board before they decided to admit a white member. This was in Indianapolis, Indiana. Then I wrote to all the Christian churches in Indianapolis and their neighborhood, and I said, every white church ought to send 2 of its members to join a black church. Nobody did. They all thought I was crazy. I'm in favor of brotherhood. I'm in favor of integration. But I'm also much more in favor of winning people to Christ, saving the lost, multiplying churches. And when we do that, that's the biggest single step toward brotherhood that can be taken. If we really want brotherhood, if we really want equality, if we really want justice, then let's bring people to the feet of Christ. And when Christ touches their life, when they're transformed, when the Holy Spirit dwells in them, then brotherhood will flow out of them. No question. No question. So I would be inclined to say, as we here in America look at our situation, let us say that what we read about in books on missions of other countries, they're very useful. And as a missionary overseas, I'm delighted when I see this, meet with this group of missions pastors who are sending missionaries overseas and sending money overseas. But I hope that someone of you will ask questions, how can we make sure that the money we send and the missionaries we spend really begin or increase the rate at which they are discipling people?
We're going to touch on that in just a minute, but let me take 2 questions and we'll blend them together while we're in this kind of historical frame of reference right now. What have you written in the past that you now disagree with? And another similar question that's not just in writing, but if you were to do things all over again, what would you do different? Is there anything you do different in your life?
Bridges of God was written as if the whole task of winning segments of the population, ethne, peoples, plural, peoples, to Christ, was a matter of overseas missions. That was my position up until 1973, 74, 75. And then I began to see that that was not only true in Africa and Asia and Latin America, it's also true in Europe and North America and California. We have got to see the actual situation. We've got to see the actual situation. So many churches in America become middle class or upper middle class. And that's not our doing, that's Christ's doing. As people become good, become honest, become hardworking, become truthful, the Lord blesses them. And they rise. A striking illustration of this came the night that I was taken out by 6 free Methodist bishops to dinner. Now, when you're taken out by one bishop, it's quite an affair. When you're taken out by 6 bishops, there was something. So I wondered what they were going to talk about. After supper, this was in Winona Lake, Indiana, which is in the northeast corner of Indiana.
We have a few brethren here with us.
And these 6 bishops said to us, we're fairly strong up here in the northeast corner of Indiana, and the northwest corner of Ohio, and the southeast corner of Michigan. And into this area there have come a lot of Appalachians. And we try to get them into our church, but we're not being very successful. How can we win the Appalachians? They come to our church, and they listen to a sermon or two, and then they never come back again. Occasionally one of them joins our church and stays for a year or two. A few of them stay longer than that, but most of them drop back out. What do we need to do to make our churches full of Appalachians? Well, after we talked about it for about an hour, and I began to ask them about conditions and so on, what they told me, in effect, was this, that our churches have been here for many, many years, scores of years, and the membership of the church has risen. We're the better people of the town. They don't swear, they don't cuss, they have good incomes, they have good houses, so on and so forth. And the Appalachians coming in are whites. They speak English. They're our people, but they're a different kind of our people. And when they come to our churches, they don't feel quite at home. So I said to them, well, my friends, if you really want to win large numbers of Appalachians, thousands of them, you'd better start some Appalachian churches. And you had better appoint to these Appalachian churches Appalachian preachers. They said none of them are seminary graduates. I said, that doesn't make any difference. Neither were the apostles. Just appoint good men, and there will be seminary graduates speaking to those people 50 years from now, maybe even 30 years from now. This is not only Free Methodist, this is also Presbyterian. Winhorn and I were called to a Presbyterian church in Denver. Let's call it I forget the name, but it was a church that had been 1,200 members, and it had shrunk to 1,000, to 900, to 800, to 700. And so they said, let's get some church growth here. And most of the people attending that church growth seminar were members of that church. And they were asking, why aren't we growing? Why are we declining? Well, they were declining because the people from that section of Denver were moving out to the suburbs. Nicer houses, nicer yards, nicer people. So they moved out there. And there were other people moving in. Oh, I said, well, you have a problem because if the blacks move. No, they said, these aren't blacks. Well, I said, if the Hispanics move. These aren't Hispanics. These are Anglos. But they're a different kind of Anglos. So I said to them, if you really want to win these people, you will have to offer them a church in which their kind of people are the elders and the deacons and the teachers of Sunday school classes. So when they come in, they'll feel absolutely at home. They'll feel that this is our church. Now, I don't want to overemphasize that, because one of the good things that churches are doing in America is they are bringing in a degree of brotherhood in all sections of society. That's good. Let's continue with that. That's an excellent thing to do. But let's remember that if we really want to win the segments of society, we must get the kind of Christianity that appeals to them, the kind of leaders that they have. Let me tell you one last story because it really fits in here. Dr. Everett Koop is now the Surgeon General of the United States, and you see his picture on TV all the time, particularly since this AIDS epidemic. And I was speaking in the 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia 25, 30 years ago. And after my address, Dr. Everett Koop, he was not then Surgeon General, of course, came up and he said, Dr. McGavran, a black tide has flowed up around this 10th Presbyterian Church on three sides. But those people aren't coming to church. What do we need to do? Oh, I said, you need to be integrated. Well, he said, we are integrated. We've got 25 black members in our church. Well, I said, what's your problem? We said, the black members that we have drive in from the suburbs. And these blacks don't. Oh, I saw it once. The blacks that they had were the educated blacks, the well-to-do blacks, the blacks who had arrived. And these blacks had just come in from the South. 2nd grade pass, 3rd grade pass, 4th grade pass, 6th grade pass. And if they went to the 10th Presbyterian Church, they wouldn't understand the sermon. It's not their kind of language. So I said to him, well, Dr. Koop, if you really want these people to become Christians, you'd better start, let's say, start with 5, next year 10, next year 15, small churches, and make sure that the pastors of those churches have no more than 8th grade education. He drew himself up to Dr. McGavran. We Presbyterians never allow pastors to be less than seminary graduates. And he walked away. Well, that is the problem. If we want to multiply churches in this kind of population, we must fit the church to that kind of population. Now, I learned this in India. The places where we planted churches were illiterates. 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 were maybe literate. Otherwise, they were all illiterate. How do you shepherd illiterate people? Now, the church that I grew up in, we didn't have any liturgy. We never memorized anything except the Lord's Prayer, maybe, and the 23rd Psalm. But I said, how in the world do you get these people who have accepted Jesus Christ and formed a church, how do you get them to become really Christian? And then I visited an Episcopal area in India where thousands of people had become Episcopalians. And I heard all these illiterate village people repeating from memory the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, the 23rd Psalm. I said, that's it. So from that time on, all of our churches, the pastors there had to cause the people to memorize these, and we became a liturgical church. And it did them a great deal of good. In other words, you've got to fit the way in which you nurture people to their situation.
Dr. McGavran, let's pick up on this thought about education. We are sitting right now in one of the most esteemed Christian institutions in the world, and you're an eminent Christian educator. Is there any direct correlation between education and missionary performance?
I was the founding dean of the School of World Mission here, and it has been my privilege to not only know the School of Missions here, which, by the way, is the largest school of missions in the world, and you're going to have the great opportunity of hearing Dean Paul Pearson, who's a wonderful dean and has done a great deal of good to this school, speak a little later on in the day. And my constant fear through the years has been that missionary education, while achieving academic excellence, must not worship academic excellence. What we must achieve and worship equally, or even in greater measure, is performance on the field. Do the people we educate here, are they finding and folding the lost? Are they multiplying churches in Argentina or in Africa or in India or in China? In short, missionary education mustn't be simply knowing about it. It must be actually carrying out Christ's command to disciple pantatithne. Now the word disciple, the Greek word is matheteosati. That's the imperative in the Great Commission. Matheteosati, pantatithne. Matheteosati means enroll in my school. It doesn't do any good just to proclaim the gospel to them. They hear it, they won't rest. So what? I stand on the street corner and I give out tracts. That's evangelism. But it's not very effective. If that's the only thing you can do, well, you better do it. A little is better than nothing. But the kind of evangelism that I think that all you pastors should be concerned with is the kind of evangelism that finds and folds the lost, that brings them back to the fold, that brings them back to the Master's house, that makes them fellow Christians, that makes them men and women full of the Holy Spirit, that makes them men and women gathering to read God's Word, not where you're speaking, but in their homes, as friends and neighbors. Let me tell you a little story that'll illustrate that wonderfully. 4 years ago, I came to hear of a wonderful church in Boston, of all places. In Boston, a pastor had been called there in 1979, just 9 years ago now, to a church that had been around 50 members, 40, 50, 60 members for 40 years or more. It was a small church, nice building. So he went there. That church is now 3,000 baptized believers. And at the time I heard about it, it was 1,500. That was 4 years ago. And I was amazed. 50 to 1,500 in 5 years. What on earth is happening? So I wrote to the pastor there, his name McKean, Pastor McKean. So I said, what are you doing? I've got a stack of correspondence with him like that. So in the course of the correspondence, he spoke about a number of things. One reason we're growing is because we haven't built a great big church building. We meet in the Symphony Orchestra Hall. Everybody knows where it is. It's a big building. Going where? Symphony Orchestra Hall, Sunday morning. People come there. Well, that's a good reason. But he didn't think that was the main reason. I said, which is your most important reason? He said, I think it's the evangelistic home Bible studies. I said, evangelistic home Bible studies? He said, yes. I said, why do you use the word evangelistic? Well, he said, if just the saints of God get together to study the Word of God, it has very little evangelistic potency, which was quite a new idea to me. very little evangelistic potency. But he said if half the people who come are non-members, non-Christians, and they study a section of the Scripture that I outline for them, then he says it's got great power. So I wrote and asked him, how many evangelistic home Bible studies do you have? Remember, his church at that time was 1,500 baptized believers. He said, we've got 150. 150 evangelistic home Bible. Yes, he said they meet every Tuesday evening. Some of them have 4 people attending, 2 members, 2 non-members. Some have 10 people attending, 4 members, 6 non-members. And that's where the faith spreads. As a lady whom we all know, our friend, we talk with her, we go to the movies with her, so on and so forth. They are now studying the Bible, and they are speaking in language that these other people understand. Well, I thought that was a very useful idea along the same line that we're talking about.
Dr. McGavran, we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes. Let me just throw it open to the guys. Perhaps there's 1 or 2 brief questions that some of you would like to direct to Dr. McGavran more extemporaneously. Anybody have something you'd like to ask?
Please feel quite free to ask anything. Nothing is going to embarrass us here. We're talking about the real situation.
You mentioned when you started looking at the situation on the mission field before writing Bridges of God that only 10% of missionaries were actually finding the lost and bringing people to Christ, and 90% were doing good work. Have you seen that change in the last few decades, and what would you assess the situation in missions today?
I wish I could say that it has radically changed, but I don't think that it has. I think that today a great deal of mission work is still good works done in the hope that they will persuade people. But I also think that the 10% who were concerned, and that 10% in some missions, not in all missions, but in some missions, that 10% has grown to 20% or 30%. And I think that many missionaries, even if they're teaching school, say to themselves, you know, this school ought to be planting a church. Or we ought to be planting several churches. And pastors out there are getting together in great groups to consider. And the pastors are getting alive to church growth. But there again, it depends upon the denomination. Some denominations are still quiescent. Some pastors are busy looking after their own flock. And if they were sitting here, they'd say, well, we've got 600 people, and I don't have a car like you in America do, and I have to go around on foot or on cycle, and I can't see our 600 people, let alone going outside. So I'm looking after my flock. That's what you'd say. So that the degree to which this has really changed things, in some places it has, in some places it hasn't. In some places there have been great change, in some places there have been little change. I wish I could be more exact, but that is about as truthful an answer as I can give to that.
One more question. Harry?
Dr. McGavran, the term church planting is kind of a catch-all term for a lot of different ways of planting the church. And the old Methodists used to ride the circuits. Many early missionaries, simply because there were so few out there, would spend a little bit of time in lots of different places, maybe have several groups starting at once. Whereas today there seems to be at least a certain school of thought that says you should pour your life into a smaller group of people and build quality rather than quantity. And you're a spokesman for church growth. How do you react to those two styles of church planting?
If by building quality rather than quantity, you mean centering your attention on a small group of people and seeing to it that they know everything in the Bible, and not being very concerned whether they ever speak to anybody about Christ or not, then I would say that that is a first-class definition for non-growing churches. They will learn all about, they'll learn the Apostles' Creed, they'll learn the Nicene Creed, they'll learn the Bible, they'll learn this, that, and the other thing, but they will never speak to anybody else. Somehow or other we've got to combine those two things. We've got to combine Christian knowledge. We've got to say Christian knowledge is incomplete until it includes how do you find the lost. It's incomplete until it includes how do you build new churches. It is incomplete until it answers the question, how do you make a house church into a permanent church? How do you make a small one Christian into several Christians? How do you make several Christians into 20 Christians? I was in Houston, Texas a few years ago, 6 to be exact, and was speaking to the Southern Baptists there. And I was talking to a Southern Baptist pastor. And he said, I live in East Houston, and right next to where I live, there's a section of Houston of 15,000 people, and we're going to plant 4 new churches there. I said, I'm surprised that in Houston there are 15,000 people and no Baptist churches. Oh, he said, we've got 2 Baptist churches there. I said, well, what's your problem? Well, he said, those Baptist churches were started 50 or more years ago, and the people in those churches are good Christians, and the Lord has lifted them, and they're sort of upper middle class, and that's a working class district, and they're not going to go to those churches. So we're starting 4 working class churches. And he said, we now have 4 house churches, and we have 7 smaller groups where they're beginning to become Christians. That sounded to me like an excellent idea. An excellent idea. We've got to look after our people, no question. That's why I believe in seminaries. We've got to look after our people. We've got to have pastors who know the Bible. We've got to have pastors who know how to pray. We've got to have pastors who love people. But we've also got to see to it that that doesn't get ingrown. We've got to see that it's constantly reaching out. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Dr. McGavran, we don't want to wear you out. We're going to take a little break and we'll come back in a few minutes, okay?
Good.
Appreciate your vantage point on many of the different missiological issues we've been talking about in this past hour. What we want to do, though, now is begin looking at some very specific questions that are especially relevant to all these men. Most of these men are missions pastors. Some of them have been in their positions for 5 and 10 years. Some of them come as missionaries before that. Others are just now beginning to get their feet wet as missions pastors. And so let's start looking at some of the issues now, some of the questions that I know that they really want to ask. Yes. And I want to start by just giving you a general question. Now we'll go to then some more specific things. But as a general question, as you're looking back over your career and as you're looking at a room full of young men full of hopes and aspirations and all concerned about evangelizing the world, what are some of the things that you'd share with them? What are things that you want to remind them, that you would want to urge them to not forget, things that if you could sort of just give them a few minutes of wise counsel and advice, what would you say to them?
I think that what I would begin with saying, it's the most important thing I'll probably say here today, is that the entire missions enterprise in all churches, in all ages, is obeying eternal God's command. Eternal God commands that the gospel be proclaimed to penta ta ethne, leading these segments of society to faith and obedience. Now that's not my word. You'll find that in Romans chapter 16, verses 25 and 26. Eternal God commands. He doesn't suggest to the churches. He doesn't suggest to missions pastors. He doesn't suggest to the head pastor. He doesn't suggest to the deacons and elders. He doesn't recommend to them. He doesn't ask them to do it. He commands that they do it. And when you turn to the Great Commission, the Great Commission is introduced in verse 18 of Matthew 28. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. What overwhelming authority. He wants to make sure that the people who listen to him don't think they're listening to the carpenter of Nazareth or the itinerant preacher going up and down Palestine, not knowing where he's going to sleep that night, not even to the atonement for sins dying on the cross at Calvary. They're listening to the ultimate authority in the universe. Therefore, he says, what's he going to say? Therefore, go to church and tithe your income? Well, those are very good things to do. But he didn't say that. Therefore, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Well, he did say that on a different occasion. But when he announces, I am the ultimate authority in the universe, he didn't say that. What did he say? He gave the Great Commission. Now, in the Great Commission, there are 4 verbs, 1 imperative and 3 participles, going, baptizing, teaching. I'm not going to speak about those, just the imperative. What does he say? He says, disciple, matheteosati, pentatithing, disciple, all the segments of society. That's what he said. That's his command. You know, when we think about sin, we think about murder and adultery and robbery and lying. But when we think about sin, we should also think about people who know the Lord but never say anything to anybody about him. That's sin. That's sin. It's a sin as great as murder, because it is keeping people from eternal life. Somehow or other, that, I think, is what I would hope that everyone here in this room comes to feel in his heart, that my work is the most important work in this church. It's getting this viewpoint out to all our members here and to all the missionaries we send over there. I'm delighted that you're sending missionaries. I'm delighted that missionaries are going out. But I would hope that as you send missionaries out, you will make sure that all of them are also committed to finding the lost and multiplying churches.
Now, all of these men are coming from a church background, but interested in and involved in missions education and with mission agencies. You're sort of coming from the other perspective, having spent your life as a missionary, working with mission agencies, concerned with missionary education, yet everything focused on planting churches. What role do you see this kind of a group of California missions pastors involved in overseas missions? Do you feel that if we're going to evangelize the rest of the world, that it's going to take primarily just more mission agencies being started? Or does this kind of a group of pastors, do they have some say in what maybe can be done? What kind of role do you see for missions pastors and for churches in this whole area of world evangelization?
If missions pastors say to themselves, our principal task is to send out missionaries, what they do out there, they will have to decide that. I think that's a wrong decision. Don't say that. I think that the missions pastors ought to say, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to send out missionaries. We're going to urge our people to give so that we can send out missionaries. That's a wonderful work. As I said in the beginning, I'm delighted and proud to be speaking to this group of men whose lives are dedicated to that end. We're going to send out missionaries. But let's also make sure that we realize that a good many missionaries spend their lives just doing good works. And they seldom talk effectively to people about Christ. And they seldom bring people to Christ. And they seldom, if never, multiply churches. so that I would say to all the missionaries you send out, I would see to it that they are educated in how to start churches. Now, please remember that starting churches is one thing in this segment of society. It's an entirely different thing in that segment of society. Here you could start 10 churches. There you'd do very well if you'd start one. Here you'll get a growing Christian movement. Here you won't get a growing Christian movement. If you're in a Muslim country, you're not going to get a growing Christian movement. Except in a few places. In Indonesia, Central and Eastern in Java, and a few other places, 200,000 Muslims have become Christians. I would urge that every missions pastor read, study, visit the fields out there. Visit the fields where your missionaries are and find out how many new churches are being started. Now, if you find that there are not very many, don't blame them. Don't blame them. They find great difficulties. They find great difficulties. I'm not suggesting that you say, hey, you're all failing. No, never. Help them all you can, but do constantly say to yourself, the goal is not just a missionary out there. The goal is a missionary who is reaping grain and bringing a sheaf back every 2 minutes. That's the goal. And there are a lot of difficulties in the way of doing that.
Now, as we're talking about that kind of a missionary, let's back up a minute. And what are the kinds of characteristics then that we're looking for in our missionary candidates in our churches that are ultimately going to be the kind of people that can be planting those churches? And what can we be doing to either cultivate those kind of characteristics? What should we be looking for?
That is an excellent question. Because as you get young men and young women from your churches whom God is calling to be missionaries, I would urge that you encourage them to visit the places in your neighborhoods and in your states where churches are growing and are multiplying. Maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in some other neighborhood. Let them see how this is done, and then send them to some places where you've got a wonderful church and no effective evangelism. Let them see the difference. Talk to them about the difference. Pray with them about the difference, so that they will see that it's quite possible to be a missionary, as I was myself between 1923 and 1930, with no evangelistic effect at all, despite the fact that I taught the Bible for 4 hours every day. In short, let's make sure that we approach the task with open eyes.
Dr. McGavran, there's a lot of controversy about short-term missions versus long-term missions. And as we look at the Protestant missionary force in the United States, over these last 20 years, there's a smaller number of long-term missionaries, a larger number of short-term missionaries. Is this okay? Is this a good trend? What do you think about short-term missions, and what would you recommend to these missions pastors? And maybe even summer missions, which might even be a shorter length of time than short-term missions.
The answer to that is very, very varied. I went up along the west coast of Canada some years ago, visiting the Indian churches that had been established there by the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians. And those churches were now decaying. Their pastors were frequently drunk. The members were drunk. The churches had just a small little group attending. And so there was a missionary society formed, send missionaries up there just for the summer. There were students. And they would proclaim Christ, and they would win people to Christ, and the churches would be filled, and then they'd go back to continue their education. And their people that they gathered in the churches would drift away. Next year they'd come up and do the same thing. And the mission executive who took me up there said, how can we stop this thing? It's that kind of problem that I think every missions pastor should be seeing in the fields that he visits. To what extent is this work really getting through? And how can it get through? What must we do in order to get through? And can we help them getting through? Now then come to the short term or the long term. Short-term people do a great deal to encourage missionary enthusiasm in the home churches. They've been over there, they see the need, they've told people about Christ, they come back, missions are a great thing. But their effectiveness is not very great. They don't know the language. They speak in English. They're translated. If you're really going to be an effective missionary, you've got to learn the language. And learning the language is not a 10-minute job. It's not a 10-day job. It's more like a year and a half job, 2-year job. Then you begin to speak the language naturally and to mingle with the people on their level and see what they're thinking, and they see what you're thinking. You're able to help them. So I would say work toward lifetime missionaries. Now there's a difficulty there. Some lands are closed to lifetime missionaries. India is closed to lifetime missionaries. You can't get a visa. You can go in for 3 months, maybe 6 months, that's all. So short-term missionaries are all that can go there. I would say to countries like India, you probably need to get members of those churches who come and become members of your churches and live here for 2 or 3 years and then are sent back. Something of that sort. In short, we Christians face a tremendous problem as nations close to the gospel. How to get through that is the biggest single question facing missions today. But let's keep on working at it. God wants us to get through that. We will get through it. But let us see that there isn't any single answer. There are a lot of different answers. Keep on looking for those answers.
If you'll beg our indulgence, we'd like to put you on the spot a little bit.
Sure.
And ask as we look at your life, you have walked, traveled, visited probably more countries and more places in those countries. It's even been estimated than perhaps anyone that's ever lived. As you look all over the world, who would be some of the key national leaders, even naming those people by name, that this group of men really needs to listen to? We need to listen to what men in other parts of the world are saying. Who would some of those men be?
There are far more of such men that I can possibly name because I don't begin to know the leaders of the churches. But one man that I would strongly recommend would be in South India, who is the president of his church there, of his denomination, and he's planting a church a week. The only trouble is that when you ask him, how are you planting it? Well, he says, we're planting it amongst Indians. He doesn't mention the caste. And if you press him, he'll say amongst the Harijans. They're the untouchables. But that is only a tenth of the truth. The full truth is he's planting amongst one Harijan caste that is open to the gospel.
Is this Ezra?
That's Ezra Sargunam.
He's a good friend.
That's right, Ezra Sargunam. Ezra Sargunam is doing a very nice job. And I would certainly spend some time with Ezra. I'd visit the churches. Then there are people in Africa. There are people in Latin America. But I would always inquire, to what extent are these people actually planting churches? In northeast India, there's a Baptist, Imotemjen Iyer. He is the general secretary of about 1 million Baptists, of the tribesmen. And then there is another Neheliana Rangjal, who is in Tripura. If you can get to Neheliana Rancho, by all means get to him, or ask him to come to meet you in Calcutta. You may not be able to get into Tripura, but he could easily fly to Calcutta. It's just across Bangladesh. And then there are people in Korea, very important indeed, to meet with Pastor Yonggi Cho, Paul Yonggi Cho, who's the head of the great church that has grown from just a handful in 1953, 54, to several 100,000. And his wonderful system of house churches, and his wonderful big church that he's built that seats 15,000, 20,000 people. That is a church that everybody ought to visit. It's in line with the big churches that you serve, except it's bigger than any of your churches.
A few times bigger.
Yes.
Let's put you on the spot a little bit more. You have worked with lots of missionaries all over the world, both denominational and independent missionaries. Who would be some of the denominational and independent, or let's put interdenominational mission agencies that, in your opinion, are doing the best job? They're out on the cutting edge, that are planting churches, that are the kinds of organizations that we ought to either be familiar with and even more than that, work with.
Denominational agencies, all missionary societies, face exactly the same problems that you do. They send out missionaries. They hope that they are planting churches. But the executives say, our business is to send them out. Our business is to raise the money. Our business is to encourage them. Our business is to see that they are working. But whether their churches are growing or not, we don't know that. I remember coming back across Belgian Congo in 1954. When I got to this country, I went to a big mission agency in New York City. And I said, in one of your stations, the church has gone down in the last 17 years from 6,000 to 3,000. And in a neighboring mission station, it's gone from 3,000 to 30,000. Oh, they said, McGavran, you're quite mistaken. Couldn't possibly happen. I said, there are 8 missionaries in each place. Couldn't possibly happen. Well, I said, I got those figures from your printed reports. Let's look and see. So they looked, and my figures were proved out. They were running the mission, but they didn't know what was happening out there. I think that's the danger we all face. We send out missionaries, we're in favor of missionaries, we pray for missionaries, we go to missionaries, we enjoy their letters. But what's actually happening, we don't know too well. And I think that whether it's a mission executive or whether it's a missions pastor, we all ought to find out what the missionaries we are sending and supporting are actually achieving by way of propagating the gospel, by way of obeying the Great Commission, by way of obeying eternal God's command. Now, immediately let me add a warning. We must find that out, but then we mustn't hurry up and blame the people who are not getting growth. Maybe nobody can get growth there. Maybe that's a Satan's stronghold. Maybe they're attacking the wall where it's 50 feet high and no cracks in it. And somebody else is attacking the wall where there's a big hole in it. I don't know. And you don't know. But let's find out, so that our support of missions, our sending of missionaries, our prayers are informed by the real situation.
Are you willing to name some names of organizations that you'd be really supportive of and would encourage these men to work with? We'll pressure once. I'm not saying don't say who we shouldn't work with, but who would be some that we really should?
I think that the Alliance Missionary Society, the Alliance Church, is doing a remarkable task. It has the church growth point of view. In the Philippines, where they had 400 churches in 1970, one of their missionaries said, let's plant 400 more in the next 10 years. Everybody laughed. The national pastors and the missionaries, they said, nonsense, impossible. It's taken us 50, 60 years to get this many churches. You think, plant another 400? But he kept at it, and kept on arguing, and kept on pleading, and kept on persuading. And so they said, all right, we'll start Operation 400. They didn't get 400 churches. They got 600. By 1980, they had 1,000 churches. And now they've got 2,000 churches. That's church. That is a missionary society that is awake to the church growth problem. Now, like all missionary societies, it has some fields in which the churches aren't multiplying. The alliance churches in India are not multiplying, except that they have recently gone to Bombay, and they're finding that in Bombay they can multiply churches. So they are beginning to multiply churches there. The Alliance Mission is one, and the Southern Baptists are another mission board that is really multiplying churches and really has some concern about not merely proclaiming the gospel, but about discipling ethnos after ethnos. It's a very big society. They have 3,000 or 4,000 missionaries out in the field right now. And of course some of those are in places where the church isn't growing.
Any interdenominational agencies that come to mind?
Interdenominational agencies. The Sudan Interior Mission is doing some nice work in the countries just south of the Sahara. Nigeria, Gold Coast, Ivory Coast. And there are some societies that are doing some good work and the SIM is doing some good work there. I would say, write to them and ask, say that you'd like to send missionaries to the areas where the churches are multiplying. Now they may say, well, sorry, we can't do that. You'll just have to... I think what I'm saying to this group of missions pastors is, you're in a field where you may find it somewhat difficult to do the most effective thing. You'll have to do the less effective thing, but do something. Granted, that's the best you can do. But constantly feel for information along the lines of where are churches getting through? Where are missionaries getting through? Where are national pastors getting through? And where are national pastors not getting through?
Let's pick that up, if we could. And let's ask about the whole movement among indigenous groups, third world mission agencies that are springing up. Is it possible for us in the West to work directly with third world mission agency groups, or is that an impossibility? And what are some of the groups that are doing a good job that we really ought to at least pray for and possibly even work with?
National agencies are springing up all over the world, and they're springing up very rapidly because of the fact that in country after country, missionaries can no longer be sent. So those people come to this country and they speak about the work they're doing and they raise money and they go back. That's good. I'm entirely in favor of that. However, like all missions, whether they're of Englishmen or Germans or Americans or Canadians or whatever, like all missions, a great many of their missionaries do not succeed in multiplying churches. There's a mission agency in India. The man who started it, I won't take his name, came to Biola and studied there for 2, 3, 4 years. Then he went back. He found he could get lots of money here in Southern California, and he has a lot of money, and he has started churches all over North India. But what are these churches? These are churches amongst the Christians who have moved to the cities. Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists and Roman Catholics. And when they go in, these Christians say, we don't have any place to meet. So he plants a church. He is not winning non-Christians to Christian faith. Now he's doing a good job. That's good. But I would say, those of you who send out missionaries know that kind of thing. You say, how in the world can we know it? Go out there, travel, and see. Go out there, travel, and see. Find out what the churches are. I was writing to one of these Indian pastors who said, my church has grown from nothing to 400 in the last 10 years. Wonderful. So I wrote to him and I said, of the 400, how many were Christians before they joined your church, and how many have come in from the non-Christians? Well, he said, 19 have come in from the non-Christians, and 381 have come in from the Christians. Well, that's the kind of information you need. In short, as you care for the church and expand it, there are all kinds of things to do. And I don't want anyone to leave this room feeling that I have been speaking simply about winning non-Christians. That is a part. That's the essence of missions. But there are a lot of other things that can be done, ought to be done, will be done.
Let's ask one last question, then we'll open it up to the men before we have several to conclude our time. I think in the areas that we live in Southern California, Northern California, around California, the presence of Satan and the obvious manifestations of the demonic realm aren't as visible as they are in some other parts of the world. How do we prepare our candidates for some of these other countries where there's very few Christians and where the demonic and satanic influences are at least more evident in some cases? What do you say about power encounters and a lot that's been written in recent days about all of this, and how can we transfer some of that information to our candidates so they can be better equipped for what they're going to face there, which may be very different than what they're facing here? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yes, that's a fair question. Power encounter, healings, infillings of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, these are all parts of the Christian process. And as I look at church growth around the world, I find that in a good many cases, church growth is fairly closely tied to some of these manifestations. Sometimes it's praying for the sick and they get well. Sometimes it is infilling the Holy Spirit and they're speaking in tongues. Sometimes it is a feeling of sudden forgiveness and happiness, so on. But that's going on. And the Lord is blessing it much more in some other countries than He is in North America. Or to put that another way, there are many more people here who are openly dubious about that kind of Christianity. I myself, in my service 31 years in India, we never went in for that kind of Christianity. But it is going on. The Lord is blessing it. And I would be inclined to say, as you send people out, if they report that sort of thing, praise the Lord and go on. If on the other hand your church says, no, we don't want anything of that sort, then don't. There's no use offending your church or its denominational position in order to share in that. But there is a good deal of that sort of thing going on, particularly in Africa and India and Indonesia and the Philippines and a few other places. Is there a question over here?
Let's open it up now. Maybe if you haven't asked before, we'll start over with Tom.
Dr. McGavran, in Bridges of God, you talked a lot about missionaries being sensitive to the people movements that start around them and being sensitive to go in and take advantage of those. And since that time, we've had a lot of emphasis on reaching unreached peoples, where we don't know that there's a people movement going on. We don't know anything going on. In our churches, we have limited resources in each case. What would be your words of advice on these two strategies of reaching those ripe fields, let's say, and sending people to what may not be ripe fields, unreached peoples? How would you balance those?
I would say that it's very well worth your effort to find movements that are growing, where God is blessing, where people are becoming Christians, where there's a constant ingathering of a group here and a group there and a new church here and a new church there, that is the way God has moved throughout all history. Europe became Christian in a series of people movements. Nobody in Norway became Christian until the year 1980. Well, that's a little bit of an overstatement. A few people did. But there was no great movement there until 980, and between 980 and 1020, all of Norway became Christian. So that this has gone on not only in Norway, but in England, and in Ireland, and in France, and in Germany, and in Italy, and so on. So that is a thing that God has blessed, is blessing, and will bless. So I would say, send people to the places where some Christward movement is going on. Now, if you can't find that, also realize that those Christward movements never start of themselves. They start when somebody has been there and has preached the gospel to maybe a resistant group for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 40 years, and then the movement starts. So we've got to do both of those things. We've got to send out to unreached people and to say to ourselves, this probably means unrewarded Christian work for some time. But we've got to make sure that the people that go to that kind of people know something about people movements, know something about discipling, know something about the Great Commission, know something about how peoples will turn to Christ, and constantly work and pray toward that end. That would be in brief my answer to that. Yes?
Okay, Al?
Dr. McGavran, the issue of modality and sodality has in some ways isolated a certain group of people within the church that has the task of evangelism and planning the church, and so in some ways has put aside like a missions clique in the church, and then the rest of the church has said, well, that's not my job. My job is other, maintenance type of a ministry. How can we combat that modality, sodality, or do we just have to go along with it and say that is the status quo and continue? Or do you feel that there's some ways in which we can work to say that this is the ministry of the whole body of Christ, not just a sodality?
I think that we've got to insist in all of our churches, in all countries, not merely in Southern California. We've got to insist in all of our churches, in all countries, that every Christian is commanded to be a witness. And many Christians are commanded to be effective evangelists. And that here in America, too many churches, they say, if any evangelism is done, the pastor will do it. Not us. We don't know enough. And so they're quiet. They're good Christians. They give. They pray. They're good Christians, but they don't tell other people. And here in America, my friends, and I trust that what I'm saying now will be heard by all of you, here in America we've got to make sure that our churches become full of practicing evangelists, effective evangelists, people who know how to speak to their neighbors, how to speak to their friends, how to win other people to Christ. James Kennedy's great story, Coral Ridge, Florida, he was a wonderful Presbyterian preacher. He went to a small church there, 20, 25 members, and he preached and he said to his people, all of you ought to go out and win people to Christ. And they'd go out and they'd come back in licking their wounds and vowing never to do it again. They'd had a bad time. And then he was called to Illinois to preach a series of evangelistic sermons there for another Presbyterian pastor. He went there. He preached a great sermon first evening. The next day, the pastor said, come along, let's go out and talk to people. So they went out, and the first house they went to, the pastor said, Jim, you talk. And Jim fumbled and stumbled and didn't know how to talk to them and came out licking his wounds. And the pastor said, oh, I see now. This man doesn't know how to talk to people. He preaches very well. So after that, during that 10-day period when he was preaching in the evening, Kennedy listened to that preacher talking to people. When he went back to Coral Ridge, he preached no more evangelistic sermons, but he himself went out quietly talking to people. And after 6 months, he had a system worked out. This is the way you do it. You start with these questions, you go on to these questions, you go on to these questions, and if they give this sort of an objection, you answer it this way, this sort of an objection, you answer it. It's a fairly wooden system, but man, it works. It works. And his church grew like everything. In short, we've got to see to it that in our churches there are large numbers of people. Some people say 10%, some people say 20%, some people say 50%. The percentage is a secondary matter, who are effective evangelism, who know how to do it, who feel comfortable doing it, who enjoy doing it. That's the kind of people we need to multiply.
Okay, Mike, I think you had a question.
Right. I'd like to follow up, Dr. McGavran, on a question you answered previously in relation to power encounter. In America, the demonizing that we see going on is different than in some of the locations that you mentioned.
Yes.
And when our candidates go to those places, they encounter the demons in a very different way. Is there anything we can do here to prepare them for those encounters?
For the encounters they'll meet overseas?
For the manifestation
Here.
of demonization in other lands, like the Philippines.
I think that all that you can do to prepare them is simply to say to them, when you read the New Testament, you see many cases like this. And yet here in America, in 1988, when a tidal wave of secularism has swept across the land, this is something you don't talk about, something decent people don't do. You've got to see through that God is at work. Now, how he is at work varies from place to place and people to people and situation to situation. But don't take a hard and fast, nothing doing. And don't pick up one method and apply it everywhere. Just see what God is doing and open yourself to God's influence and to God's leading. Something like that, I would say, would be a good answer.
We have time for some more.
May I make a comment on
Sure.
that?
Glad to have you here, Dr. Pearson.
Ed Murphy, who is now with Vice President of Overseas Crusades, used to teach at Biola, I happened to stay with Ed and his wife last weekend, is doing seminars on power encounter. He just did one a month. We hope to have him do one here eventually. And Ed is beginning to teach in that field. Tim Warner Trinity is also. This is an area where a number of mission scholars who are theologically solid are beginning to do some teaching and thinking, and I think this preparation will be helpful.
Good.
Right.
Ed's putting, before I went to Brazil.
Ed's putting together a tape series on that also.
It's already out.
Which is that right?
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions? We have time for 3 or 4 more. Right here, Roger.
Yeah, Dr. McGavran, beginning in 1950 with the first venture for Victory basketball teams to Taiwan and then Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the phenomenon of sports evangelism has been growing, yet it still remains an untapped resource in most of the churches and in much of the mission field. If you see this of value, what suggestions would you have for the churches who would like to employ it? Or how would the church begin to work with the mission agency in causing that to be a tool for the process of evangelization?
I would do 2 things. In the first place, I would say to the churches you're speaking to in this country that this is a form of evangelism that God has blessed and is blessing and will bless. This gets through to a certain section of the population that otherwise you don't reach. And the other thing I would say is just make sure that when the evangelism is carried out there, when these winning teams speak about Christ, they don't just say, come to Christ, and then a lot of people come to Christ. Whether they ever join a church, nobody ever knows. Make sure that the people who come to Christ do join a church. Now that's a great big field, and unless that's done, what will happen is what happens after so many evangelistic meetings. People come to Christ, they walk down to the front of the church, and that's the last time that you ever see them. They don't become living, practicing Christians in some congregation. That must be emphasized. So that I would say emphasize both of those things.
Somebody else, Jay.
Dr. McGavran, a missionary goes where Christ has not been proclaimed and sees people come to Christ, and he writes home, "I have planted a church." What would be the definition of a church? In your definition, what would be the characteristic or the irreducible minimums that would constitute him writing home and saying, "I have planted a church"?
It's an excellent question because it opens up a very big field. A church I would define in a New Testament term. In the New Testament, we never read about a single church building. Paul never says, "When I come to Corinth, we'll raise 500,000 drachma and build a great, big, beautiful building at the corner of Justice and Alexander Street." Never. In fact, when Paul speaks about a church, he's really speaking about a group of house churches. The church in Corinth never met in one place. It met in this house and that house and the other house and the other house and the other house. That's the New Testament church. And in Rome, in the 16th chapter, you see a long list of names. The first 2 or 3 verses speak about the church in your house. But the other names are also, there are 5 groups of them. And many scholars believe that there were 6 house churches in Rome. So that I think that we've got to say that the church in New Testament terms is a group of people who will meet regularly to study the Word. Perhaps that is going to be led by a slightly literate man. It may even be led by an illiterate man who memorizes and sees that they memorize. But it must be a regular meeting, and it must continue on, and the pastors must get, those unpaid pastors must get a certain kind of training so that they are called together once a month or once every 2 months or whatever to be trained and helped to become effective leaders. And then eventually I would hope that there would be some kind of a building. The building is not unimportant. It's very useful when it rains. And I would be inclined to think that some such program as that would be what would meet your need.
Any questions over this side of the room? Anybody? Anybody over here? Yeah, I'm just trying to get somebody who hasn't asked any before. Anybody else have a question? Okay, we'll maybe take Harry and Jim, and then we'll wrap some things up. Jim?
Dr. McGavran, integral to church growth is goal setting and planning for growth, and this is taken not only for individual churches, but also multiplication of churches, reaching countries for Christ, and even world evangelization.
Right.
And David Barrett has written of the hundreds of plans for world evangelization, and today there's a big emphasis on reaching the world by the year 2000. Recently in Christianity Today there was a cover article on can we reach the world by the year 2000. How do you view that specific goal of world evangelization by 2000, and how do you view the future of the missions movement in general?
That's an important
90 seconds.
That's an important question and a very touchy question. I think that that's an excellent promotional idea, the evangelization of the world by the year 2000. Wonderful. But I don't think it's very realistic. I think that reaching the world there is undefined. Do you mean simply proclaiming the gospel all across Arabia, all across Afghanistan, all across the 25,900 castes in India from which there has been no Christward movement at all? And so I think that what we're really facing is a period of years, decades, maybe centuries, in which as the Church of Jesus Christ becomes evangelistically alive and hears God's command and determines to obey God's command, we will see Christian movements starting in segment after segment of the population of the world. Now, the length of time, that's in God's hands. It's not in ours. But we are to go forward doing the best we can under today's circumstances.
Gary, briefly.
Dr. McGavran, you've touched on this several times a little bit, but one of the chief criticisms of the church growth movement is that everybody runs where the action is and nobody takes the tough jobs of preparing the soil. How should we be doing that? It sounds like you said earlier, well, if you can't find a live place to go to one of these dead ones, but is there really how do you really mean that as far as what percentage of our resources ought to be put towards totally unreached, unresponsive people?
The Lord in Samaria said, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that are ripe to harvest, and then send laborers into the harvest. That's necessary to do. But those ripe fields would never have happened if somebody hadn't plowed the ground and sowed the seed and watered the plants and kept out the wild animals. In other words, there is the preparation that is absolutely necessary. Now, what proportion of our effort should be given to reaping the ripe fields, and what proportion should be given to sowing, plowing and sowing and cultivating? That is something that no one can give an answer to, because there are millions of answers depending on the different circumstances. But I would certainly say that one of the things that needs being done today is to see where the fields are ripe and make sure that the ripe fields are reaped, and also to see that the unripe fields are prepared so that there'll be a harvest there also. I think it'd be wonderful if the United States government would say to the Afghans, we will help you get the Soviets out, provided that you will give us a promise that after you establish an Afghan government, you will allow Christian missionaries to live there.
Dr. McGavran, if we could just close with this one question. This is going to embarrass you a little bit, but we all love you and esteem you so much. I'd like to just ask you this in closing. As you would look back over your career, what would you see as the single most important contribution that you've made to in your ministry? How would you want people to remember you?
I think that what has really happened, has been that God has taken my life and has used it in ways that I had never anticipated. I think that God has taken my life and used it in ways that I had never anticipated. For example, I never anticipated coming down here to Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm a graduate of Yale Elementary School and Union Theological, and to come here. But that's what God intended. And when I first came down here, and Dan Fuller met me at the airport, he didn't know me, I didn't know him, so he waved a copy of The Bridges of God as we came off the plane. And so I knew that this was... And we drove down through these gas-filled canyons, and I said, Lord, you're not bringing me here. And he said, that's what you think. Stand aside.
So you never know what the Lord might do with a life committed to Him.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think we need to show our appreciation to Dr. McGavran.